I have more respect for a man who lets me know where he stands, even if he's wrong.
We always said in Black Panther Party that they can do anything they want to us. We might not be back. I might be in jail. I might be anywhere. But when I leave, you can remember I said with the last words on my lips that I am a revolutionary.
New Nubian.
Constitutional Law, Individual Rights and Government Powers, presented by Dr. Jonah Sanders. Course objectives: to provide learners with a foundational understanding of constitutional law in the US, with a focus on the balance between individual rights and government powers as interpreted through landmark cases and constitutional principles. Course outline Module 1, Introduction to Constitutional Law Module 2, Structure of Government Powers Module 3, Individual Rights under the Constitution Module 4, Government Limits and Protections Module 5, Landmark Cases and Applications Module 6, Review and Quiz. Course syllabus. Module topics covered time learning objectives 1. Intro to Constitutional Law Constitution, Powers, Judicial Review 15 minutes. Understand the structure and scope of constitutional law 2. Government Powers Branches Clauses checks 25 minutes identify and explain government authority under the Constitution 3. Individual Rights Civil Liberties, Due Process 30 minutes, understand constitutional rights and protections 4. Government Limits 4th, 8th Amendments 20 minutes. Learn legal protections against government overreach 5. Landmark Cases Key Decisions and Outcomes 20 minutes analyze how courts shape constitutional interpretation 6. Review and Quiz Recap Plus test 10 minutes reinforce understanding and evaluate retention. Module 1, Introduction to Constitutional Law. Objectives: understand what constitutional law is, learn the structure of the US Constitution, explore landmark cases like Marbury versus Madison, analyze the concepts of separation of powers and federalism. What comes to your mind when you hear Constitution? What is constitutional law? Constitutional law governs the interpretation and application of the US Constitution, why it matters, shapes all US legal and political systems, sets the framework for citizens' rights and government power. Think about: why would a country need a written constitution? Definition of constitutional law details. It includes the rules that define how the government operates, covers branches of government, executive, legislative, judicial, protects individual rights. Example: Brown versus Board of Education, Supreme Court ruled racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause. Why constitutional law matters: 2 key roles, structures government power, federal versus state powers, separation of powers, protects individual rights, Bill of Rights, civil liberties and civil rights impact. Example: Roe versus Wade and Dobbs versus Jackson decisions, debates around privacy and state power. Can you think of a time when a constitutional right was in the news? The Constitution as a living document. Explain. The Constitution can be interpreted differently over time. Courts often rely on originalism, living constitutionalism. Discuss: why is interpretation necessary? Is the Constitution too old to still work today? Deep dive. Why do we need a written constitution? Guided discussion. Written constitutions provide clarity, limits, and accountability, prevents abuse of power, helps unify diverse people under shared principles. Group question. What could go wrong in a country with no written constitution? Anatomy of the US Constitution Structure Overview. Preamble, Purpose Articles, Government Branches and Powers Amendments. Rights and updates highlight Bill of Rights, protects individual freedoms 14th Amendment, due process and equal protection activity. Asks students to name a right guaranteed in the Constitution. Breakdown of the Constitution's Structure 1. Preamble. The purpose, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. Explanation. Sets the goals of the Constitution. Acts like the introduction to a mission statement. 2. Articles I v. Sen, the blueprint of government AUKUS Y Legislative Branch 2 Executive Branch 3, Judicial Branch v. State versus Federal Powers v. Amendment Process via Supremacy, Clause for ratification. Which branch do you think has the most power and why? Focus on the amendments. What are amendments? Changes or additions made to the Constitution over time. Show flexibility and growth of the nation. Highlight 1. Bill of Rights protect individual liberties like speech, religion, press, assembly, petition, bear arms protection from unreasonable searches right to a fair trial. These were added shortly after ratification to ensure individual protections. Highlight 2. 14th Amendment due process and equal protection guarantees that no state shall deny to any person equal protection of the laws, used in major civil rights cases including Brown versus Board of Education. Why this structure matters. Flexibility. Through amendments it evolves. Balance of power. Articles divide roles and prevent tyranny. Protection. Amendments ensure no rights are absolute but all are protected. Think of the Constitution like the owner's manual for the US government. Deeper dive articles on 3 articles overview. I Legislative. Congress makes the laws 2 Executive. President enforces laws 3 Judicial. Courts interpret laws. Question. Which branch seems the most powerful and why? Articles 3. The 3 branches of government. Imagine running a country by yourself. What tasks would be hardest to manage? Transition statement. The US Constitution divided power into 3 branches to prevent tyranny and ensure checks and balances. Let's explore how Articles I and 3 created this structure. Article 1. Legislative branch role. Creates federal laws split into House of Representatives and Senate key powers. Taxation and budget control, declaring war, regulating commerce, impeachment authority. Think about. Why do you think the framers listed this branch first? Quick fact. Congress can override a presidential veto with a 2-3 vote. Article 2. Executive branch role. Implements and enforces laws passed by Congress key powers. Commander-in-Chief of military appoints federal officials and judges, makes treaties, can veto laws. Think about. Should one person have so much power? Quick fact. The president must be a natural-born citizen and at least 35 years old. Article 3. Judicial branch role. Interprets laws and constitution, oversees federal court system. Key powers. Judicial review, life tenure for federal judges. Think about, why do you think judges serve for life? Quick fact. There is no mention of the number of Supreme Court justices in the Constitution. Comparing the branches. Branch makes laws, enforces laws, interprets laws. Legislative makes laws, executive enforces laws, judicial interprets laws. Which branch seems the most powerful and why? Encourage debate. Some might say Congress, others might say executive. Some might favor judicial. Judicial review. Marbury versus Madison case summary. In Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court gave itself the power to declare laws unconstitutional. Key point. Established judicial review, ensuring laws follow the Constitution impact. Made the Supreme Court a co-equal branch in checking legislative and executive actions. Optional. Insert a 1-minute video summary of the case. Separation of powers. Power is split between 3 branches to prevent tyranny. How it works. Checks and balances. Example. Congress passes a law, President can veto, Supreme Court can strike it down. Discussion. Why is it dangerous to have all power in one branch? Case study. Separation of power action. Real example. Congress passes a healthcare law challenged in court. Supreme Court rules on constitutionality. Diagram. Show arrows between branches indicating checks. Ask. Can you think of a recent example from the news? Federalism. Dividing power. Federalism equals shared power between national and state governments. Examples. Federal, immigration, foreign policy. State, education, policing. Shared, taxing, roads. Think pair. Share. What powers should states have more control over? Wrap-up summary review. What constitutional law is how the Constitution is structured, the importance of Marbury versus Madison principles of separation of powers, and federalism. Key takeaway. The Constitution creates a balanced government that protects freedom. Exit questions and discussion reflection prompts. What surprised you about the Constitution? Why is judicial review essential in a democracy? How does federalism affect your daily life? Option. Quick exit ticket with 1-minute written answer. Module 2. Structure of government powers. Legislative powers. Article 1 branch. Congress makes laws. Bicameral, Senate, and House of Representatives. Powers. Taxing, spending, regulating commerce, declaring war, etc. Elastic clause expands power. Introduction to the legislative branch, key points. Legislative branch equals Congress main function. Makes laws Congress is the first branch listed in the Constitution. Shows its importance talking prompt. Why do you think the founders put Congress first in the Constitution? Structure of Congress, bicameralism key points. Bicameral equals 2 chambers, Senate 2 per state House of Representatives, based on population balance of power. Small states versus large states designed by the Great Compromise engagement. Ask, why do we have 2 chambers instead of 1 like some countries? Enumerated powers of Congress from Article 1. Taxing and spending, control of federal budget, regulating commerce, interstate and international trade, declaring war. Congress, not the president, officially declares war, raising and supporting armies, coining money, post offices, immigration laws, patents, etc. Example: Congress passed laws regulating internet commerce. Congress declared war on Japan after Pearl Harbor. Which of these powers do you think affects your daily life most? The elastic clause, necessary and proper, clause located in Article 1, allows Congress to stretch its powers to meet new needs, often called the elastic clause. Historical example: creation of the first Bank of the US, used in McCulloch v. Maryland. Confirmed implied powers discussion question: is it good or bad that Congress can stretch its powers? Checks on legislative power key points. President can veto bills, courts can declare laws unconstitutional, public opinion and elections also limit power. Executive powers, Article 2 branch. President enforces laws. Powers: Commander-in-Chief, veto power, foreign policy, executive orders, appoints federal officials and judges. Introduction to the executive branch key points. Created under Article 2 of the US Constitution, headed by the President of the United States. Main function: enforces laws passed by Congress. Engagement prompt: why is it important to have a separate person or branch to enforce laws? Commander-in-Chief role key points. President commands the military forces, cannot declare war, but can direct military action. Modern examples: deployment of troops, drone strikes. Example: President Obama ordered the mission to capture Osama bin Laden. Discussion question: should one person have that much control over the military? Veto power and legislative check key points. Can veto bills passed by Congress. Congress can override with 2/3 vote in both chambers. Encourages negotiation between branches. Example: presidents frequently threaten to veto to influence legislation. Quiz prompt: can a president's veto be final? Foreign policy powers key points. President handles diplomatic relations with other nations, negotiates treaties, appoints ambassadors, speaks for the US on global issues. Example: President Biden's handling of NATO support for Ukraine engagement. Should the President or Congress control foreign policy more? Executive Orders Key Points. Legally binding directives from the President do not require congressional approval, can be challenged in court or overturned by the next president. Example: President Trump's travel ban, President Biden's student loan forgiveness attempts discussion prompt. Are executive orders a helpful tool or too much power? Appointment power key points. Appoints cabinet members, federal judges, Supreme Court justices must be confirmed by the Senate. Example: recent Supreme Court appointments: Amy Coney Barrett, Ketanji Brown Jackson prompt. Why do you think the Senate must approve these appointments? Judicial Powers Article 3 Branch. Federal courts interprets U.S. Supreme Court and lower federal courts' power of judicial review life tenure for judges. Introduction to the Judicial Branch Key Points. Established under Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution, main function: interprets laws and the Constitution, resolves legal disputes, ensures justice is applied fairly prompt. Why is it important to have an independent branch to interpret the laws? Structure of the federal court system. Key points. Supreme Court, highest court in the land courts of appeals. Hear appeals from lower courts, district courts, trial level courts where cases begin. Diagram: U.S. Supreme Court courts of appeal, district courts. Example: a case starts in district court, is appealed to circuit court, then may go to Supreme Court. Interpreting laws. Key points. Courts clarify how laws should be applied, decide what laws mean when applied to real-world cases. Supreme Court rulings set precedents for all lower courts. Example: Brown versus Board of Education interpreted segregation laws as unconstitutional. Discussion prompt: how do judges influence daily life even though they don't make laws? Judicial Review, Marbury versus Madison. Key points. Judicial review power to declare laws actions unconstitutional, not explicitly in Constitution, established in Marbury versus Madison, makes judiciary a powerful check on the legislative and executive branches. Example: Roe versus Wade, Obergefell versus Hodges prompt. Why do you think judicial review was not originally written into the Constitution? Life tenure for judges. Key points. Federal judges serve for life purpose. Protects judicial independence, free from political pressure. Can make unpopular decisions without fear of losing their job. Example: justices serving 30, 40 years engagement prompt. What are the pros and cons of judges serving for life? Checks and balances. Each branch limits the powers of the others. Examples: President vetoes legislation, Congress overrides veto or impeaches, courts strike down laws or executive actions, Senate confirms appointments. Commerce Clause. Congress regulates trade among states, foreign nations, and tribes. Interpreted broadly by courts, used to justify civil rights laws, labor laws, environmental regulations. Introduction to the Commerce Clause key concept. Gives Congress authority over economic activity that crosses state or national lines. Engagement prompt. Why would the founders give Congress power over trade between states? Scope of the Commerce Clause key points. Covers interstate commerce, international trade, tribal trade. Example. Congress can regulate goods shipped across state lines, like trucks transporting produce from Georgia to Florida. Clarification. Does not cover purely local commerce unless it affects interstate trade. Broad interpretation by the court's key points. Courts have interpreted the clause broadly, expanding federal power, especially during the New Deal era and beyond. Famous cases. Wickard versus Filburn, wheat grown for personal use affects overall market. Case can be regulated. Gonzalez versus Reich, medical marijuana grown at home affects interstate market. Equals can be regulated. Engagement prompt. Should the federal government have this much reach into local decisions? Use of the Commerce Clause in civil rights and reform. Key applications. Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation in businesses like hotels, restaurants. Labor laws regulating minimum wage, workplace safety. Environmental laws. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. Why it matters. Enabled Congress to address social justice, health and safety using economic authority. Prompt. Would the Civil Rights Act have passed without the Commerce Clause as justification? Limits on the Commerce Clause key cases. US v. Lopez, Gun-Free School Zones Act ruled unconstitutional because it didn't relate clearly to commerce. Shows there are limits. Not everything can be called commerce. Discussion prompt. Where should the line be drawn? What is truly interstate commerce? Necessary and proper clause allows Congress to make laws needed to carry out its enumerated powers. Basis for implied powers supports creation of agencies. Introduction to the clause purpose. Gives Congress flexibility to carry out its enumerated powers. Nickname. Called the Elastic Clause because it allows Congress to stretch its authority. Prompt. Why would the Constitution need a catch-all clause like this? What are implied powers? Key concepts. Not every power Congress uses is written in the Constitution. If a power helps carry out an enumerated power, it's implied under this clause. Implied powers are necessary to make the government function. Example. Constitution says Congress can collect taxes. So, it impliedly can create the IRS to do that job. Visual analogy. Enumerated power equals blueprint necessary, and proper clause equals tools to build the structure. Landmark case, McCulloch, Maryland summary. Congress created a national bank. Maryland tried to tax it. Supreme Court ruled. Congress can create a bank. States can't tax federal institutions. Key takeaway. Confirmed that Congress has broad implied powers under the Elastic Clause. Prompt. Why was it important to allow Congress to create a national bank, even if the Constitution doesn't say so directly? Real-world applications. Agencies created under implied powers, IRS, to enforce tax laws. FBI, to help enforce federal criminal law. Federal Reserve manage national monetary policy. NASA space exploration under scientific and defense powers. Engagement prompt. Can you think of any government program that might not be possible without implied powers? Limits and debates. Concerns. Critics argue the clause gives too much federal power, raises questions about the balance between federal and state authority. Key case. US v. Comstock upheld implied powers to detain mentally ill sex offenders beyond their sentence under federal authority. Discussion prompt. Where should we draw the line with implied powers? Supremacy Clause, Article VA. Federal law is the supreme law of the land. State laws must yield when in conflict with federal law, applied in cases of preemption and constitutional challenges. Introduction to the Supremacy Clause. Key concept. Federal law overrides state law when there is a conflict, establishes the Constitution's authority over all laws. Prompt. Why is it important to have one supreme set of laws? Meaning of supreme law of the land. Key points. US Constitution and federal statutes take priority. State constitutions and laws must comply with federal law. Prevents legal chaos from conflicting state systems. Example. If a federal law says one thing and a state law says the opposite, the federal law wins. Visual. Federal Constitution. State laws. Preemption doctrine. Definition. When federal law preempts state law. Types. Express preemption. Federal law specifically states it overrides state law. Implied preemption. Inferred when state law conflicts or interferes with federal goals. Case example. Arizona versus United States. State immigration law struck down because it interfered with federal immigration policy. Prompt. Can you think of an area where state and federal laws might clash? Constitutional challenges. Key points. State laws challenged in court for violating the US Constitution. Example. Same-sex marriage bans struck down after Obergefell versus Hodges. States can pass laws, but courts can strike them down if they conflict with constitutional rights. Discussion prompt. What happens when a state disagrees with a Supreme Court ruling? Real-world examples of supremacy. Examples. Marijuana legalization. Legal under state law, illegal under federal law. Voting rights laws. Federal courts struck down discriminatory state practices under the Voting Rights Act. COVID-19 mandates. Conflicts between federal guidelines and state executive orders. Prompt. Should states be allowed to go their own way even when federal law says otherwise? Summary slide. Legislative makes laws. Art. Executive enforces laws. 2. Judicial interprets laws. Power is balanced through checks. Commerce, elastic, and supremacy clauses expand federal reach. Discussion questions. Why is the separation of powers important in a democracy? Can one branch ever become too powerful? How do clauses like necessary and proper affect federal authority? Module 3. Individual rights under the Constitution. Bill of Rights overview. First 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution protect individual liberties from federal government overreach. Examples. First Amendment, speech, religion, press, assembly. Fourth Amendment, protection against unreasonable searches. Sixth Amendment, right to a fair trial. Introduction and historical context. What is the Bill of Rights? The first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1791 to protect individual freedoms, created in response to concerns that the original Constitution gave the federal government too much power. Prompt. Why do you think people feared a strong central government after the Revolution? Purpose and function. Core purpose. Limits the power of the federal government, protects key civil liberties such as free speech right to privacy, fair trial protections. Protection from excessive punishment. Important concept. The Bill of Rights serves as a shield for individuals against government overreach. Can you name a freedom you enjoy that's protected by the Bill of Rights? Key amendments. Deep dive. Freedom of expression protects speech, religion, press, assembly, petition, the government. Real-world example, protests, journalism, and religious practices. Prompt. Can speech be limited? What if it's hateful or dangerous? Protection against unreasonable searches. Protects your body, home, belongings, and communications from unwarranted searches. Requires probable cause and judicial warrant. Case example, Mapp versus Ohio, exclusion of illegally obtained evidence. Would you feel safe if the police could search your phone without a warrant? Right to a fair trial protects speedy and public trial, impartial jury, notice of charges. Right to confront witnesses. Right to an attorney. Real-world application. Ensures justice for both the innocent and guilty. Prompt. Should everyone, even someone accused of a serious crime, have a right to a lawyer? Incorporation doctrine. Originally applied only to federal actions. 14th Amendment. Extended protections to actions by state governments. Incorporation through due process clause of the 14th Amendment. Case example, Gitlow v. New York. Introduction and historical context before the 14th Amendment. The Bill of Rights only applied to the federal government. States could limit speech, religion, or conduct searches without violating the Constitution. Prompt. Should your rights depend on which state you live in? Case study, Gitlow v. New York. Benjamin Gitlow was arrested for distributing a socialist manifesto. Argued New York violated his First Amendment freedom of speech. Supreme Court ruling. First time the court states must follow the First Amendment through the 14th Amendment's due process clause. Marked the beginning of incorporation. Key, quote, freedom of speech and of the press are among the fundamental personal rights and liberties protected by the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. Incorporation in action. Incorporated rights examples. First Amendment, free speech. Fourth Amendment, search and seizure. Sixth Amendment, right to counsel. Fifth, protection against self-incrimination. Unincorporated. Third Amendment. Seventh Amendment. Prompt. Should all rights be incorporated? Why or why not? 14th Amendment, key clauses Due Process Clause. No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Equal Protection Clause. Laws must treat individuals equally. Landmark for civil rights and individual liberties. Introduction to the 14th Amendment. Background. Ratified in 1868, after the Civil War, intended to protect the rights of freed slaves, became the foundation for many civil rights and liberty protection structure. Contains several clauses focused today: due process and equal protection prompt. Why do you think a post-Civil War amendment still matters so much today? The Due Process Clause key points. Applies Bill of Rights protections to the states, ensures fair procedures before the government can take away rights, protects fundamental rights, privacy, marriage, parenting, voting. Landmark cases: Roe versus Wade, right to privacy; Gideon versus Wainwright, right to legal counsel; Miranda versus Arizona, right to remain silent. Engagement prompt. What does liberty mean to you in everyday life? The Equal Protection Clause key points. Government must treat people equally under the law. Used in challenges to discrimination, forces states to justify laws that treat groups differently. Landmark cases: Brown versus Board of Education, ended racial segregation in schools. Loving versus Virginia, struck down laws banning interracial marriage. Obergefell versus Hodges, legalized same-sex marriage. Prompt. Why is equal protection still a big issue in modern society? How the 14th Amendment transformed the Constitution. Key points. Before, Constitution mainly limited federal government. After, now states must follow many of the same rules. Empowered courts to expand civil liberties and strike down unjust state laws. Example: states must now follow the First Amendment because of incorporation. Freedom of speech, religion, and press speech. Protected unless it incites violence or constitutes hate threats. Religion. Establishment Clause and Free Exercise Clause. Press. Freedom to publish without prior government restraint. Cases: Tinker versus Des Moines, Engel versus Vitale. New York Times v. U.S. Introduction to the First Amendment core freedoms covered. Speech, religion, press. Prompt. Why do you think the First Amendment was placed at the top of the Bill of Rights? Freedom of speech key points. You have the right to express opinions, even unpopular ones, not absolute. No protection for inciting violence, true threats, defamation, hate speech that crosses into incitement. Landmark case: Tinker versus Des Moines. Students wore black armbands to protest Vietnam War. Supreme Court ruled students don't lose free speech rights at school. Prompt. Should schools be allowed to limit student speech? Freedom of religion. 2 key clauses. Establishment Clause. Government can't promote or establish religion. Free Exercise Clause. Government can't interfere with individual practice of religion. Landmark case: Angel versus Vitale. Public schools held official prayer. Supreme Court ruled unconstitutional under Establishment Clause. Examples: wearing religious clothing in public school equals protected. Government funding a specific religion equals prohibited. Prompt. Should public schools allow prayer led by students? Freedom of the press key points. Press can investigate and publish freely, including criticism of the government. No prior restraint. Landmark case: New York Times v. U.S. Government tried to stop publication of Pentagon Papers. Supreme Court ruled press had the right to publish. Prompt. When, if ever, should the government be allowed to stop the press from publishing something? real-world applications, and challenges modern issues. Hate speech versus protected speech on social media, religious exemptions to laws, press freedom versus national security engagement. How does the First Amendment apply to social media platforms? Right to privacy. Implied right not explicitly listed, but derived from various amendments, key cases. Griswold versus Connecticut, birth control Roe versus Wade, abortion rights, Obergefell versus Hodges, same-sex marriage. Introduction to the right to privacy. Key points. The right to privacy is not explicitly stated in the Constitution. It is an implied right, derived from multiple amendments. First, freedom of association and beliefs. Third, protection from quartering soldiers. Fourth, protection from unreasonable searches and seizures. Fifth, protection against self-incrimination. Ninth, recognition of other rights not listed. Prompt. Should rights that aren't written word for word still be protected? Griswold versus Connecticut, birth control rights. Facts. A Connecticut law banned birth control, even for married couples. Dr. Griswold was arrested for giving contraceptive advice. Ruling. Supreme Court struck down the law, found a zone of privacy in the penumbras of the Bill of Rights significance. First time, the court recognized privacy as a constitutional right. Prompt. Why might privacy in marital decisions be important to protect? Roe versus Wade, abortion rights. Facts. Texas law banned most abortions. Jane Roe challenged it as violating her right to privacy. Ruling. Supreme Court said a woman's decision to have an abortion falls under the right to privacy. Impact. Established trimester framework for abortion regulation, later modified by Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Discussion. Prompt. How should the court balance privacy with state interest in health or morality? Obergefell versus Hodges, same-sex marriage. Facts. Same-sex couples sued for the right to marry in their home states. Ruling. Supreme Court rule bans on same-sex marriage violate due process and equal protection. Right to marry is a fundamental liberty protected by privacy principles. Quote from ruling. The fundamental right to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples. Engagement. Should personal relationship choices be a matter of public law? The controversy and limits. Key points. Right to privacy is controversial because it's not explicitly written. Critics argue courts are creating rights. Supporters argue that personal autonomy must be protected in a modern society. Second Amendment, right to bear arms, a well-regulated militia, the right of the people to keep and bear arms. Modern interpretation includes individual gun ownership. Landmark case. District of Columbia versus Heller recognized individual right, but allowed reasonable regulation. Introduction to the Second Amendment historical context. Written in the 18th century, when militias were crucial for defense, reflects concern over tyranny, self-defense, and states' rights. Prompt. Why would the founders include a right to bear arms in the Constitution? Early interpretation's traditional view tied the right to arms with service in a state militia. Some courts and scholars argued it was not an individual right. Shift in understanding. In the 20th century, debates emerged over whether it applied to individual gun ownership. Prompt. Should gun rights depend on militia service or individual use? Modern interpretation, District of Columbia versus Halifax. DC law banned handguns and required all firearms to be unloaded at home. Dick Heller, a security guard, challenged the law Supreme Court ruling. The Second Amendment protects an individual's right to possess a firearm. Especially for self-defense in the home, however, the right is not unlimited. Quote from the court. Like most rights, the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited. Significance. Major victory for gun rights advocates left room for reasonable regulations. Regulation and ongoing debate. Permitted regulations. Banning felons or the mentally ill from owning guns. Restricting gun possession in sensitive places. Background checks, waiting periods, and licensing laws. Recent developments. Cases challenging bans on semi-automatic weapons, concealed carry restrictions, etc. Prompt. How do we balance gun rights with public safety? Controversies and cultural impact. Key points. Highly polarized issue in US politics and culture linked to concerns about violence, freedom, and constitutional limits. Discussion prompt. Should the Second Amendment evolve as society changes? The Constitution protects individual liberties primarily through the Bill of Rights. The 14th Amendment ensures these protections apply to state governments. Courts play a key role in interpreting and applying these rights. Discussion questions. Why is the 14th Amendment so critical to individual rights? How has the right to privacy evolved through the courts? Should the Second Amendment be limited more strictly? Module 4, Government Limits and Protections. The Fourth Amendment, Search and Seizure Text. The right of the people to be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures requires probable cause warrant requirement. Key case, Mapp versus Ohio exclusionary rule. Introduction to the Fourth Amendment purpose. Protects privacy and property from government overreach, applies to police searches, home entries, electronic surveillance, and more. Prompt. Why do you think the founders wanted to protect people from unreasonable searches? What makes a search or seizure unreasonable? Key principles. Probable cause. A reasonable belief that a crime is being committed or evidence is present. Warrant requirement. Police must get a warrant from a judge unless a valid exception applies. Protected areas. Home, car, personal belongings, phone, and digital data. Prompt. What do you think counts as a search today, especially with technology? Warrant exceptions when a warrant isn't needed. Consent. You allow the search plain view. Evidence is clearly visible. Exigent circumstances. Emergency situations. Search incident to arrest. After a lawful arrest. Automobile exception. If probable cause exists for a car. Example. Police smell marijuana during a traffic stop. Eeks may be probable cause. Prompt. Do you think it's fair for police to search a car without a warrant? Key case, Mapp versus Ohio, the exclusionary rule facts. Police entered Mapp's home without a proper warrant, found illegal materials, argued the search was unconstitutional ruling. Supreme Court ruled in Mapp's favor. Obtained illegally cannot be used in court impact. Applied the exclusionary rule to state governments, reinforced importance of constitutional procedures prompt. Should evidence be thrown out if it proves guilt, but was collected illegally? Modern applications and controversies issues today. Phone data and digital privacy, police body cams, stop and frisk programs challenged under the Fourth Amendment, surveillance and national security prompt. Do we need stronger protections today, or are current laws enough? Real-world impact. Fourth Amendment police need a warrant to enter your home, search your phone. Exceptions: consent, plain view, exigent circumstances, queue for class. Can a school search a student's backpack? Everyday protections of the Fourth Amendment core idea. The Fourth Amendment protects your personal space and privacy from government overreach, even in modern situations. Examples: police must have a warrant to enter your home, search your phone, access your digital records prompt. What would it feel like if someone could search your texts without your permission? Modern case highlight: Riley versus California facts. Police searched Riley's smartphone after arrest without a warrant ruling. Supreme Court said smartphones contain too much personal info. Police need a warrant to search a phone, even after an arrest. Key quote. Modern cell phones are not just another technological convenience. They hold for many Americans the privacies of life. Engagement prompt. Should police ever be allowed to search your phone without a warrant? Exceptions to the warrant rule: police may act without a warrant if consent, you agree to the search, plain view, illegal items are in clear sight, exigent circumstances, urgent situations, search incident to arrest, limited search, after lawful arrest, scenario discussion. If police knock and you say, come in, that's consent. If drugs are on a table and visible through a window, that's plain view. Special case: school searches question for class. Can a school search a student's backpack? Key case: New Jersey Vic TLO. Schools can search students with reasonable suspicion. Aim is to protect school safety, but still must be reasonable prompt. Is it fair that students have fewer privacy rights in school? Quick scenario discussion. Pose real-life examples and ask students. Can a police officer search your locked glove compartment without a warrant? Can airport security go through your bags? Can a teacher read your texts if you leave your phone on the desk? Encourage brief discussion on each scenario. The Fifth Amendment, self-incrimination and due process. You have the right to remain silent. No forced confessions. Right to remain silent during questioning. Due process clause. Equals fair procedures before life, liberty, or property is taken. Key case: Miranda versus Arizona. Introduction to the Fifth Amendment text overview. Protects individuals from self-incrimination, requires fair legal procedures before the government can take life, liberty, or property. Key protections covered today. Right to remain silent, right to due process prompt. Why would the Constitution protect people from talking to the police? The right to remain silent self-incrimination clause. No person shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. Key concepts. You don't have to answer questions that might incriminate you applies during police questioning, trials, and even congressional hearings. Real life meaning, you can say, I plead the fifth. Why might someone choose to remain silent even if they're innocent? Miranda versus Arizona. Miranda writes facts. Ernesto Miranda confessed after police questioning without being told his rights, argued that he didn't know he could stay silent or have a lawyer Supreme Court ruling. Police must inform suspects of their rights before questioning. If they don't, the confession can't be used in court. Miranda warning includes, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in court. You have the right to an attorney. Discussion prompt. Should police always be required to read Miranda rights? Due process clause key points. Requires fair legal procedures before government takes your rights or property. Includes notice of charges, right to a fair hearing, right to present evidence examples, right to a trial before going to jail, right to appeal decisions in court. Prompt. How would the system be unfair without due process? Real-world scenarios and impact examples. A suspect confesses before being read their rights. Equus confession may be thrown out. A student suspended without a hearing. Keeks may violate due process. Police using threats or pressure to get a confession equals illegal. Due process in action ensures notice of charges, opportunity to be heard, neutral decision maker applies in criminal and civil cases. Example, school expulsion hearings. What is due process? Definition. Due process means the government must follow fair procedures before taking your life, liberty, or property. Applies in both criminal cases, e.g. arrests, trials, sentencing, civil cases, e.g. school discipline, government benefits, property seizures. Prompt. What would happen if people didn't get a chance to defend themselves? Core elements of due process. 1. Notice of charges. You must be told what you are accused of, must be clear and timely. 2. Opportunity to be heard. You must have a chance to explain your side. This could include presenting evidence, calling witnesses, or giving your version of events. Neutral decision maker. The person or group deciding the case must be unbiased, no conflict of interest or personal involvement. Example, a person charged with a crime must receive an indictment and fair trial. Example, a student facing suspension must be told the reason and allowed to respond. School expulsion hearing example scenario. A student is accused of fighting and faces expulsion. Due process means they get written notice of the charges, they get a hearing to explain what happened, the school board or panel must be neutral. Court case example, Goss versus Lopez, students suspended without a hearing. Supreme Court ruled students must receive notice and a hearing. Prompt. Should students be treated like adults when it comes to due process? Why Due Process Matters protects against abuse of power, wrongful punishment, unfair or biased decision-making applies to government actions, not private companies, schools, police, courts, public agencies, engagement prompt. Have you ever seen or experienced a situation where someone didn't get a fair process? The Sixth Amendment fair trial rights guarantees in criminal prosecutions. Speedy and public trial, impartial jury right to confront witnesses, right to a lawyer, key case. Gideon versus Wainwright, free counsel for poor defendants. Introduction to the Sixth Amendment part of the Bill of Rights applies in criminal prosecutions. Ensures fairness and due process in court. Talking points. Importance of protecting the accused from unjust trials applies to both federal and state cases. Speedy and public trial must not unreasonably delayed open to the public and media. Talking points. Prevents government from keeping someone in jail without trial transparency. Ensures accountability. Discussion question. Why is it important for trials to be public? Impartial jury text. Trial by jury of peers. Jury must be unbiased. Talking. Jury selection process. Right to a fair cross-section of the community activity. Idea. Have students brainstorm what makes a juror impartial. Right to confront witnesses. Text. Cross-examination of prosecution witnesses prevents secret evidence. Talking points. Also known as the Confrontation Clause, protects against false accusations. Example. A defendant can challenge a witness's credibility in court. Right to legal counsel. Text. Every defendant has the right to a lawyer. If unable to afford one, the state must provide. Talking points. Critical for a fair defense, lawyers ensure defendants understand the law and trial process. Key case, Gideon versus Wainwright. Summary. Clarence Gideon was denied a lawyer because he couldn't afford one. Supreme Court ruled 9-0 that states must provide free legal counsel in criminal cases. Key points. Extended right to counsel to state courts. Landmark moment in criminal justice equality. Optional video clip. 2-minute summary or dramatization of the case. Discussion question. How would Gideon's trial have gone without legal representation? Why it matters. Sixth Amendment. A fair trial equals foundation of justice, prevents wrongful convictions, protects against government abuse. Public defenders uphold this right. Think about. Can someone really defend themselves in court? Introduction. Why the Sixth Amendment matters. A fair trial equals foundation of justice. Justice system must treat all people fairly, regardless of income, race, or background. Talking points. The Sixth Amendment is not just legal theory. It affects lives. Every accused person deserves a real chance to defend themselves. preventing wrongful convictions. Without fair trial rights, innocent people can go to prison. Examples: exonerations through DNA evidence cases where lack of legal counsel led to injustice. Discussion prompt: what happens when someone doesn't have a fair trial? Protection from government abuse limits power of police, prosecutors and judges, no secret trials, forced confessions, or hidden evidence talking points. The government must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. These protections are especially important for vulnerable communities. The role of public defenders uphold the Sixth Amendment every day, provide free legal help to people who can't afford a lawyer. Talking points: often overworked and underfunded, but vital to justice. Without them, the right to counsel is meaningless. Optional media: show a short video interview clip of a real public defender. Can someone really defend themselves? Think about, can someone really defend themselves in court? Discussion activity: ask students to role play, one as a defendant, the other as a prosecutor. Ask, who has the advantage without a lawyer? What if the defendant doesn't understand the law? Conclusion: the legal system is complex. Without a trained lawyer, people risk losing their freedom unfairly. The Eighth Amendment: cruel and unusual punishment, excessive bail, fines, cruel and unusual punishments, torture or barbaric penalties, limits death penalty and life without parole for minors. Key cases: Furman versus Georgia, Roper versus Simmons. Introduction to the Eighth Amendment: excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Purpose: protects against government abuse in punishment, ensures proportionality in bail, fines and sentencing. Prompt: what would be an example of a punishment that goes too far? What counts as cruel and unusual? Prohibited punishments: torture, public mutilation, or beatings. Grossly disproportionate sentences for minor crimes, punishments that are outdated, degrading, or inhumane. Modern questions: is solitary confinement cruel? Are long prison terms for non-violent crimes excessive? Prompt: should punishment always match the crime exactly? Death penalty and the Eighth Amendment. Key case 1. Furman versus Georgia. Court struck down the death penalty as it was being applied, ruled it was arbitrary and discriminatory. Violating the Eighth Amendment led to temporary halt of executions. Key case 2. Roper versus Simmons. Court banned the death penalty for juveniles under 18, ruled it was cruel and unusual to execute minors, used evolving standards of decency and psychological evidence. Prompt: should the age of the person change how we view the punishment? Life without parole for juveniles. In recent cases, the court said, mandatory life sentences without parole for juveniles violate the Eighth Amendment. Must consider the youth's potential for rehabilitation. Discussion: is it ever fair to say a teenager should be in prison for life no matter what? Real-world impact and ongoing debates. Modern issues: use of the death penalty in certain states, harsh sentencing laws, treatment of inmates. Prompt: what's one way you think the justice system could be more humane? Controversies. Eighth Amendment, is solitary confinement cruel? What about mandatory minimum sentences? Evolving standards of decency debate. Should the death penalty be abolished? Introduction. The Eighth Amendment, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Protects individuals from harsh or disproportionate punishments. Interpretation has evolved with society's view of justice and human dignity. Solitary confinement debate. Is solitary confinement cruel and unusual? Some prisoners are held alone for 23 hours a day, linked to mental health deterioration, especially in juveniles and people with disabilities. Arguments against. Causes long-term psychological harm, considered inhumane by many human rights organizations. Arguments for. Needed to manage dangerous inmates used for protection or punishment. Prompt. When should solitary confinement be allowed? Mandatory minimum sentences. Are they fair or excessive? Laws that require fixed sentences for certain crimes. Judges cannot lower sentences, even in minor cases. Controversy. Can lead to life sentences for non-violent crimes, disproportionately affect minority and low-income defendants. Prompt. Should judges have more discretion in sentencing? Evolving Standards of Decency. Supreme Court uses the idea that the Eighth Amendment must reflect evolving standards of decency in society used to end. Death penalty for juveniles, life without parole for non-violent juveniles. Prompt. Should the Constitution evolve with society's values? Death penalty debate. Should the death penalty be abolished? Arguments for. Irreversible if wrongfully convicted, costly, lengthy legal process. Unequally applied. Arguments against. Deterrent for serious crimes, retribution for victims and families, reserved for worst of the worst. Prompt. Is the death penalty justice or outdated punishment? Summary. These amendments protect us from government overreach. Fourth. Unlawful search seizure. Fifth. Silence and fair procedures. Sixth. Legal representation and fair trial. Eighth. Fair punishment. These rights limit state power and safeguard liberty. Discussion questions. Reflect and respond. When can rights be limited for public safety? Which amendment do you think is most important and why? Can protections ever be misused? Module 5. Landmark Cases and Applications. Marbury versus Madison issue. Can the Supreme Court declare laws unconstitutional? Holding. Yes, establish judicial review. Impact. Strengthen the power of the judiciary to interpret the Constitution. Key quote. It is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. Historical background context. End of John Adams' presidency. Adams appointed midnight judges. William Marbury was one of them, but his commission wasn't delivered before Jefferson took office. Jefferson's Secretary of State, James Madison, refused to deliver it. Question for class: should a new administration be forced to carry out the decisions of the old one? Legal question in the case main issue: can the Supreme Court force the government to deliver a judicial appointment? Deeper question: can the court strike down a law passed by Congress as unconstitutional? Framing prompt: who decides what the Constitution means, the people, the president, or the courts? Holding and reasoning. Holding: Supreme Court could not issue the order under the Judiciary Act of 1789 because the law gave the court power beyond the Constitution. Key outcome: for the first time, the court declared an act of Congress unconstitutional. Key quote: it is emphatically the province and duty of the Judicial Department to say what the law is. Chief Justice John Marshall. What is judicial review? Definition: the power of the Supreme Court to review and invalidate laws or government actions that violate the Constitution. Impact: made the judicial branch equal to the executive and legislative. Gave courts the final say on constitutional interpretation. Prompt: how does judicial review protect individual rights? Long-term impact on U.S. government. Strengthen the courts. Supreme Court became the ultimate interpreter of the Constitution. Courts gained power to check Congress and the President. Modern use examples: Brown versus Board struck down school segregation. Roe versus Wade struck down abortion bans. Obergefell versus Hodges struck down same-sex marriage bans. Brown versus Board of Education issue: does racial segregation in public schools violate the 14th Amendment? Holding: yes, separate but equal is inherently unequal. Impact: landmark case for equal protection and desegregation of schools. Key concept: overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. Historical background context: segregation was legal under Plessy versus Ferguson. Separate but equal: doctrine. Southern states maintained separate schools for black and white children. Schools were unequal in quality. Funding and access. Question for class: can something really be equal if it's separate? Legal issue in the case main question: does racial segregation in public schools violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment? 14th Amendment text: no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Holding and reasoning. Holding: yes, racial segregation in public education violates the 14th Amendment. Reasoning: separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Segregation harms children's sense of self-worth. Overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. Key quote: separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Impact of the decision. Legal impact: desegregation of public schools became mandatory. Set precedent for challenging segregation in other areas. Social impact: energized the civil rights movement. Inspired other key actions like the Montgomery bus boycott and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Prompt: how did this decision change the lives of students across America? Challenges and legacy challenges. Some states resisted integration, led to court-enforced desegregation and busing programs legacy, still cited in modern cases on equal access and racial justice. Miranda versus Arizona issue. Are suspects required to be informed of their rights during police interrogations? Holding. Yes, under the Fifth Amendment, suspects must be advised of their rights. Impact led to Miranda warnings being standard procedure. Example warning. You have the right to remain silent. Background and context facts of the case. Ernesto Miranda was arrested for kidnapping and rape. He confessed during police questioning he was not told he had the right to remain silent or to an attorney legal question. Does the Fifth Amendment require that suspects be informed of their rights before interrogation? Should police be required to tell people their rights? Miranda warnings explain purpose. To make sure suspects understand and can voluntarily waive their rights if not given. Any confession or statement may be excluded from evidence prompt. What happens if someone is never told their rights? Impact and importance why it matters. Protects individuals from coerced confessions, ensures fairness in the justice system, applies to custodial interrogations. Ongoing debates. Are the warnings too rigid or too flexible? Can people truly understand their rights under pressure? Prompt. Have you ever seen a Miranda warning used in a TV show or movie? Real-world example and class scenario. Police arrest someone and begin asking questions without reading their rights. They confess. Question: can that confession be used in court? No, because the suspect wasn't informed of their rights first. Citizens United v. FEC issue. Can the government limit political spending by corporations? No, corporate funding of independent political broadcasts is protected under the First Amendment. Open the door to super PACs and significant campaign finance changes. Introduction to the case background. Citizens United, a non-profit, wanted to air a film critical of Hillary Clinton during the 2008 primary season. The Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act prohibited corporations unions from making electioneering communications close to elections. Legal question. Does the First Amendment protect corporate political spending? Constitutional principles involved First Amendment. Focus on freedom of speech. Is spending money on political ads a form of speech? Precedent. Buckley versus Valeo distinguished between contribution limits and expenditure limits. Austin versus Michigan Chamber of Commerce allowed limits on corporate political spending to prevent corruption. The Supreme Court's decision majority holding. The court ruled corporate funding of independent political broadcasts cannot be limited under the First Amendment. Overruled parts of Austin and McConnell v. FEC, majority opinion. Political speech does not lose protection simply because its source is a corporation. Dissenting opinion, Justice Stevens. warned of corporate influence drowning out individual voices, emphasized the dangers of unlimited corporate influence in politics, concerns raised risk of corruption, erosion of public trust in democratic institutions. Case scenarios and group discussion. Scenario 1. A student-led newspaper is censored by school officials. Which case or constitutional principle applies? Scenario 2. A suspect confesses without being read their rights. Which precedent should the court consider? Censorship of student newspaper. Discussion prompt. Was the school allowed to censor the newspaper? Does the First Amendment apply in schools? Hint for students. Think about the principle of free speech and cases involving student expression. Relevant case: Hazelwood School District versus Kuhlmeier Holding. Schools can exercise editorial control over student speech in school-sponsored activities if their actions are reasonably related to legitimate pedagogical concerns. Tinker versus Des Moines students do not shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate. But Tinker dealt with personal expression, not school-sponsored activities. Key concept: free speech is protected, but schools have limited authority to regulate it, especially in school-sponsored media. Confession without rights. Read discussion prompt. Should the confession be admissible in court? What rights were possibly violated? Hint for students. Think about due process and self-incrimination protections. Relevant case: Miranda versus Arizona Holding. A suspect must be informed of their rights before custodial interrogation. Confessions made without this warning cannot be used in court. Key concept: Miranda rights are critical to protecting the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and the Sixth Amendment right to counsel. Class activity instructions. In groups, choose a landmark case. Summarize the facts. Identify the constitutional issue. Explain the ruling and its impact. Share your case and thoughts with the class. Module 6. Review and quiz. Summary of key principles covered in this course. Understanding the structure of US government individual constitutional rights, key landmark cases and their impact, government limits and protections. How law shapes justice and equality. Review highlights what you should remember. Branches of government and their powers. Bill of Rights protections, 14th Amendment. Due process and equal protection. Major cases: Marbury, Brown, Miranda. Citizens United Rights in court, 4th, 5th, 6th and 8th Amendments. Quiz instructions. Mini quiz. Choose the best answer, multiple choice, or true, false, think critically, reflect on course material. Ready? Let's begin. Quiz questions 1. Which branch interprets the law? A. Executive. B. Legislative. C. Judicial. D. Quiz questions 2, 3, 2. True or false? The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches. 3. The Bill of Rights includes how many original amendments? 5B, 10C, 12D, 15. Quiz questions 4, 4. Which case established judicial review? A. Brown v. Board, Marbury v. Madison Sir, Miranda, Arizona, Roe Wade. Quiz questions 5, 6, 5. True or false? The President makes laws. 6. The Eighth Amendment addresses A. Free speech. B. Fair trial. C. Cruel punishment. D. Voting rights. Quiz questions 7, 7. Which clause gives Congress power to regulate trade? A. Necessary and proper. B. Commerce Clause. Clause C. Supremacy Clause. D. Equal Protection Clause. Quiz questions 8, 9, 8. True or false? Citizens United was about gun rights. 9. What does due process guarantee? A. Military service. B. Fair legal procedures. C. Voting access. D. Tax exemptions. Quiz questions 10, 10. Which amendment ensures right to counsel? A. 5B na mandatsy 7D de la Final thoughts and certificate info. Congratulations. You've completed the course. Review your quiz, reflect on key takeaways. Your certificate will be emailed to you upon quiz completion. Questions?